Hi everyone. It's really important for you to be able to recognize the size of certain angles, like to be able to look at an angle and say, okay, that looks like pi over 6 radians. And so in this video, I'm going to give you a strategy for how to label all the important angles of the unit circle. So the important angles that I want to label are the quadrant angles. So that's pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. 2 pi is all the way around. Pi is half of that. So that's the first one I'm going to label. I'm going to separate my unit circle into two parts. So I start at 0. If I go all the way halfway around, that lands me at pi. Pi over 2 is half of that. So I can draw in the one that separates my pizza into quarters. And that one's pi over 2. So I can think about this as pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. If I go another one, that's the same as pi. And then 3 pi over 2. And then 4 pi over 2 gets me back to 0, which is the same as 2 pi. So the next set of special angles that I want to label are the multiples of pi over 4. So pi over 4 is half of pi over 2. So if I separate all the quadrants into halves, then what I get is, well, this is pi over 4 because it's halfway to pi over 2. So I have 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and 8 pi over 4. So it's easy to see that if I were to simplify 2 pi over 4 by dividing top and bottom by 2, I'd get pi over 2. So that one gets repeated, but that's okay. So now I've labeled pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, which is pi, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4 are the new ones. So those are the multiples of the 45 degree. Now I have told you that pi over 6 and pi over 3 are very important because they're part of our 30, 60, 90 triangles, our special triangles. So I want to be able to label those too. So pi over 6, if we think about that one, it separates pi into 6 equal parts. So I can draw in, I can separate half the circle into 6 equal parts. So 1, 2, 3, 4, because this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So 6 equal parts. I could do the same thing on the other side. So just by drawing these through. So that tells me the first one is pi over 6. If I go to the next one, that's 2 pi over 6. The next one, 3 pi over 6. 4 pi over 6. 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6. 7 pi over 6. 8 pi over 6. Let me get out of the way here. 9 pi over 6. 10 pi over 6. 11 pi over 6. And finally 12 pi over 6. Now some of these can be simplified so that they actually will be multiples of pi over 3. Because 2 pi over 6, a 2 in the top cancels with a 2 in the bottom, so that's the same as pi over 3. So maybe I'll use a different color. 3 pi over 6 is pi over 2, which we already had. 4 pi over 6 has a 2 in the numerator and the denominator, so that simplifies to 2 pi over 3. 5 pi over 6 doesn't simplify. 6 pi over 6 is pi. 7 pi over 6 doesn't simplify. 8 pi over 6, though, becomes 4 pi over 3. 10 pi over 6 is 5 pi over 3. 11 pi over 6 doesn't simplify, and 12 pi over 6 brings us back to 2 pi. So when you're labeling the unit circle, my suggestion is to first label your quadrants, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2. Then count out your pi over 4s, which separate each quadrant into halves. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4. Then separate each quadrant into thirds with these pink lines and draw them through so that they're all separated, and then count out your pi over 6s. 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 pi over 6s. And then if you want to get them in terms of pi over 3, you just need to simplify some of them. So that is my strategy for labeling the unit circle. I hope that it helps you to remember these special angles. Good luck, and I'll see you soon.